Imagine that you're a football player. Every day you are outside running in the blazing heat in order to practice runs for an upcoming game. After being yelled at by coaches and rerunning the same plays over and over again, you have to condition after practice, running sprints, planks, burpees, and other things to strengthen you to become a better football player. You get tackled and have to get up and keep going while coaches yell at you to toughen up. Once you get home, you're sitting on the couch talking to your parents about how practice was, and you tell them about how difficult it was, and they brush you off and laugh and say that it doesn't really matter because football isn't a real sport anyways. This is the struggle competitive cheerleaders face all the time. They spend time in the gyms conditioning, stunting, tumbling, and jumping for hours at a time. They lift girls over their heads in stunts and catch falling girls by putting their entire bodies underneath them to protect them from hitting the mats. At competitions, they fit 3 stunt sequences, a standing running tumbling pass, a standing tumbling pass, a running tumbling pass, a cheer, and a dance all into a 2-minute, 30-second routine and have to go as full out as possible. Even after putting in all this physical and emotional work, competitive cheerleaders are still laughed at and told that what they do isn't a real sport. After being a competitive cheerleader most of my life and researching about why most people don't see competitive cheerleading as a sport, I'm here to tell you all about why it should be considered a sport. In this speech, I will talk about what people do to discredit cheerleaders as a sport and why that is hurtful to cheerleaders and why what they do should be considered just as much as a contact sport as other sports such as football or basketball. Let's talk about why people often discredit cheerleaders. Most of the time, cheerleading is just viewed as a sport that girls do, and that it usually comes secondary to sports such as football because they aren't the main event and they're just there to support. Most people only think of sideline cheerleaders when the word cheerleader is brought up. They don't consider competitive cheerleaders as cheerleaders. They are often seen as inferior to other sports because they are only there to support or entertain, and they are often over-sexualized by people who watch them. Teams such as the Dallas Cowboy cheerleaders are seen as cheerleaders when really they are just dancers. They are often over-sexualized and seen as provocative bad girls. They do not separate people don't often separate these dance teams like the Dallas Cowboy cheerleaders from competitive cheerleaders, and this discredits other competitive cheerleaders because Dallas Cowboy cheerleaders and other teams don't do things such as stunts or tumbling, which doesn't make it look like a high contact sport at all. A reason that you should consider cheerleaders as a sport is because in the last 20 or 30 years there's been a major shift in cheerleading. Teams such as all-star teams, elite gyms, and private gyms all work tirelessly to prepare teams for competitions. Also, in the past 20 or 30 years, cheerleading has began to include men in cheerleading, and it has made the sport more competitive and harder to become successful in. Now that you understand the shift that has occurred in cheerleading and why often people discredit cheerleading, let's talk about why you should consider cheerleading more seriously. Cheerleaders often practice full-out routines for hours at a time. Because the sport has become more competitive, coaches are pushing cheerleaders to the max of their levels in order to make their routines award-winning routines. Cheerleaders also don't have a defined season, so they train all year round. Most teams run from July to June, and then girls retry out for teams in July and continue practicing for the next competition year. Also, cheerleading is a high-contact sport just like football or basketball. Cheerleading accounts for more than 60% of all catastrophic sports injuries in girls. Things like concussions and skull fractures are highly common in cheerleading, and because cheerleading isn't usually taken seriously by people's parents or friends, injuries often go unseen and unchecked and can result in even worse injuries in the girls. Now that you understand why cheerleading is as much of a competitive sport as everything else, let's talk about the consequences of not considering cheerleading a high contact sport. By not considering cheerleading as much as a contact sport as anything else, it discredits girls and turns girls away from becoming cheerleaders because it's not taken seriously. Cheerleaders train the same amount of time as any other sport, and they condition and train like any other top athlete. Cheerleading can also give high school girls the opportunity to attend colleges they normally couldn't on athletic scholarships. But just because the girl gets there on athletic scholarships, her being pretty or peppy doesn't just keep her on the team. She has to keep up her training and be able to perform like a top athlete in order to keep her spot on the team. By not accurately taking into consideration the time, effort, energy, and work put in by cheerleaders, by not considering the time, effort, work, or energy put in by cheerleaders for their teams, cheerleaders often get discouraged and want to quit because people don't take them seriously, and this could affect them in the long run because they don't have opportunities like getting scholarships to colleges. I ask everyone to continue to change the connotation of cheerleading, and instead of keeping an idea of them being inadequate or secondary to other sports, I ask you to consider the strength it takes to become a professional cheerleader.